During the First World War, the Germans beat back the Russians in a massive way. The losses during the war, the strained behavior of the regions, shortages in important goods, and more issues caused deep troubles within Russia. These eventually caused an overthrow of the Tsarist government and an installation of a troubled republic. But this new republic didn't sign peace with the Germans, instead choosing for a new offensive which failed. This, and more issues, caused the faith in the new government to fail as well, eventually leading to the Bolsheviks overthrowing the new government, after which the Bolsheviks made peace with the Germans, and after years of civil war they established the Soviet Union. One of the most important actions by the Bolsheviks in their early days was them deciding that peace with Germany was preferable to continuing the war. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was humiliating, and would deeply scar Russia, but it was preferable to continued war with the Germans. So what if this didn't happen? What if, in an alternate timeline, like the government before it, the Bolsheviks decided to continue the war with the Germans? But first, some history. In 1917, everything changed in terms of the balance of power in World War I. While for years there was mostly stalemates on both fronts, in 1917 everything had suddenly changed. First, it seemed to be in favor of the Entente. There was turmoil in Russia, the Tsar had fallen, and the new government was still continuing the war against the Germans. The Germans would continue to occupy German forces in the east, while in the west, fresh American forces would come pouring into the front lines. It seemed almost inevitable that soon the Germans would be unable to hold the Western Front. But then the tides of war shifted again. The February Revolution had failed. The democratic provisional government in Russia, which had agreed to continue the war, had now fallen. Their replacement were the Bolsheviks under Vladimir Lenin and his comrades. One of the main promises the Bolsheviks had made before coming to power was to end the war with the Germans. In December of 1917, an armistice was signed between the new Russian Bolshevik government and the Germans. While a good sign for the Germans, the Russians could still start fighting again at any time, so the German forces had to remain in the east. Only when a clear peace deal was signed in March of 1918 could the Germans really pull all of their forces west and attempt one final offensive before the Americans arrived in too large numbers. But it was not enough. Initial German offensives were promising, but then they bogged down. With each passing day, German food was running thinner. The Austrian and the Ottoman empires were unraveling further, and the numerical superiority of the Western power increased as American forces arrived on the Western Front. Despite the peace with Russia, it could not provide the materiel nor the troops needed for Germany to win the war. In November of 1918, the Germans surrendered. Only 8 months after the Soviets signed their peace, there was a total collapse of the Central Powers. But the way the Bolsheviks conducted their peace negotiations with the Germans was an interesting one. One of their main strategies was delaying the actual peace deal. Their promise to make peace would be held up for as long as the armistice held on, while the longer the war continued, the more hope there was for the Western powers to intervene, a revolution to take place in Germany or the West, or Germany and Austria to simply collapse. In February, Germany offered Trotsky an ultimatum. They would surrender the Baltics, parts of Ukraine and all of Poland to Germany. Trotsky convinced Lenin not to sign this peace. Instead, Trotsky and Lenin decided on an interesting strategy to fight the Germans. They would stop fighting, but they would never sign a peace deal. The hope was that the Germans wouldn't bother to keep pushing, while it was a matter of time before the socialist revolutions would rock the Central Powers. But everyone with half a mind would understand how this went for the Bolsheviks. For a couple of days it seemed to work. Despite the armistice running out, the Germans weren't pushing. But then the Germans began to move again, and without opposition, drove deeper and deeper into Russia than they had ever been before. 2 weeks after the strategy of not opposing the Germans, but not signing a peace deal either, the Germans came back with a new ultimatum, the one we know as the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. All of Ukraine would now be lost, as well as Finland. The Bolsheviks held a vote. Lenin declared that the peace deal had to be signed, or Lenin would resign and the world revolution would fall altogether. In the 13-man Central Committee of the Bolsheviks, 6 of the members supported signing the peace deal, 3 opposed it, and 4 abstained. When the proposal was brought to the equivalent to a parliament in Bolshevik Russia, 116 voted for peace and 85 voted against it. So, all things considered, it was a relatively close call in both bodies, but the Bolsheviks had chosen peace. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed, and the Great War continued like we know it in our own timeline. But what if, in an alternate timeline, the Bolsheviks continued with Trotsky's plan? Despite the losses during the first weeks of the policies, the Bolsheviks would decide to continue. The Russians would not fight the Germans anymore, but no peace deal would ever be signed. The hope would be that, much like with Napoleon's advance into Russia, it doesn't matter how much land is taken or how deep the enemy was inside of Russia, as long as Russia doesn't surrender, none of that matters. So if only like a dozen minds can be changed, this could very well have become the Bolshevik policy. Keep on stalling until the Germans get tired, the West starts to push, or revolution and unrest takes over the Central Powers. How would the war turn out in this alternate timeline? Initially, the Germans would start pushing against the Russians without resistance. Every couple of weeks, the astonished Germans push further and further into Russia without any resistance. But eventually, the German advance would still begin to slow. The deeper the Germans push into Russia, the worse their supply routes get. For 2 months, between February and April, the Germans would keep making steady progress in the east. Every time the Germans asked the Bolsheviks for peace again, but the Bolsheviks would refuse. We will not fight, but we will not make peace either. By May of 1918, the Germans would stop. As the Germans make impressive gains in the east, the threat of the buildup of American forces in the west is still growing. By May, 1 million American forces have arrived in France, and around 100,000 Americans are joining the front every single day. The Germans have 2 choices here. Hope that eventually the Bolsheviks get tired and surrender, giving the Germans hope for a final successful push, or accept that the Bolsheviks simply won't surrender but move all the German troops west anyways. After months of the no peace policy, the Germans would realize that the Bolsheviks were serious. They are not surrendering anytime soon. If the Germans wait any longer to move forces west, they will guarantee that the Americans will overwhelm the Germans there. German forces would start to move west, but it would be too late. The Americans have arrived in such large numbers that any German push would be ineffective. Any dead German cannot be replaced, while more and more Americans are joining the ranks. But not all is well in Bolshevik Russia. Russia would be falling apart again. The people would feel betrayed by the Bolsheviks. Despite the Bolsheviks' claim that they are no longer fighting the war, so there is technically peace, the German push into Russia would still be noted and be seen as a betrayal. Meanwhile, Lenin would face a difficult choice. He had threatened to quit if the war would continue and peace wasn't signed, obviously hoping it would never come to it. So, does Lenin actually resign now? I personally don't believe it. Lenin would never voluntarily leave his position of power. He was too proud, too ideological, and too power hungry. But his threat has now backfired, as with Lenin still remaining in power, he is also seen as a liar internally. But, to be honest, this may be the least of the Bolsheviks' concerns. All the other socialist movements and any anti-war Bolshevik would withdraw their support from Lenin's government. So, while the Bolsheviks are pursuing a no peace, no war policy against the Germans, they are still fighting pretty much everywhere else in Russia. Across the nation, anti-Bolsheviks, anti-war groups, monarchists, nationalists, socialists, anarchists and more begin to rise up across Russia. While Germany takes more and more land, an alternate Russian civil war still begins, but with a drastically weakened Bolsheviks at the helm. But back to the World War real quick. After German forces attempt a final, desperate offensive in the west, which fails, all hope for a Central Powers victory is stomped out. Not only are there fewer German forces than in our timeline in the west, as millions are still needed in the east to quell revolts and protect against a potential Bolshevik counterattack, the German attack also comes months later than in our own timeline. There are fewer Germans and way more Americans. Instead of a final hurrah, giving some Germans hope for final victory, the offensive would make clear that Germany is done for. By June of 1918, the weakened German army would collapse under a massive Allied counteroffensive, as very few now believed in German victory without the propaganda victories of Russian surrender and the Spring Offensive. So it's quite likely that a couple of months earlier than our own timeline, the Central Powers would completely collapse. The Bolsheviks' stall for time worked. Partially. The Central Powers had cracked before they did. But this would not mean the end of Russian troubles. The civil wars had now started, and it would not end. The Bolsheviks' cause would have been discredited thoroughly during the war. Assuming the Bolsheviks even managed to hold out for the 4 months between their policy of not fighting and the surrender of Germany, which is debatable but possible, the end of the war would do little to help the Bolsheviks at this point. The Germans were right in their gambit, and their sacrifice helped bring the Germans down months earlier than in our own timeline. But the Bolsheviks had sacrificed themselves and their revolution for this larger victory. By the time Germany falls, everyone in Russia would be in opposition to the Bolsheviks, and the Bolshevik government would fall probably before the end of 1918. Perhaps Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin and others make it out of the nation, perhaps they are found and shot. But by this time, the Romanovs would likely have been shot already, and with the Bolsheviks out of power, the Paris peace treaties were about to begin. Without Russia leaving the war, and especially after the fall of the Bolshevik government, whichever faction is dominant in the Russian Civil War at the time would be reluctantly invited to the Paris Peace Conference. Without a communist faction in power in Russia, and without the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk being signed, and so the Germans officially still being at war with Germany, the Allies would simply have to invite Russia to this conference. So now we face a difficult question. Who would come out on top in Russia without the Bolsheviks? Well, obviously, this alternate civil war would be just as complicated as our own. It's not simply a matter of Bolsheviks against the Whites, but there are many, many sub-factions within the White movement. The main answer to who would win would be compromise. While the White movements would win, this would leave the choice between republicanism, dictatorship, democracy, constitutional monarchy, and more. One of the most likely compromises, satisfying most conservative and liberal elements, would be a constitutional monarchy of some kind. Adding to the internal stability it could provide, it would also give the Russians a chance to raise their standing with the monarchist Brits and the democratic Americans and French. So, the new Russian government sends representatives to Paris, while in the meantime they are still fighting across Russia to prevent separatist and alternate ideologies from imposing them internally. And this would be the main difference between a white victory scenario in the Russian Civil War and this one. The Russians are now represented in the Paris peace treaties after the war. So initially, the Russians would enter the peace deal extremely confidently. The French and the British had a habit before World War I of promising everything to just about anyone who asks, just to get them into the war, despite them not even remotely planning to go through with this. A similar thing would happen with Russia. Russia would enter the peace deal seeking recognition of their pre-war promises. Russia would want Russia's pre-World War I borders to be restored, Russia would want to gain lands from the Germans, Russia would want to receive control over Constantinople and the Dardanelles Strait, and more. But all of these ambitions would be pretty quickly shot down by the French and the Brits. Why would France and Britain still betray Russia, I hear you ask? Well, on the one hand, because the French and the Brits would still fear Russia. Russia was still a giant when they recovered from their issues. A developed Russia, in control over some rich German lands, the Bosphorus Straits, and Russia's population and resources, would be a nation capable of domination over most of Eurasia. Apart from this long-term fear, in the short term, many French and Brits would still feel like the Russians abandoned them during the war. They pretty much lost and all but surrendered to the Germans. Despite no peace deal being signed, there was no renewed Russian push against the Germans, and many Germans were still able to leave the Eastern Front to start fighting in the West. The invitation of the new Russian government to Versailles would mostly be a courtesy and a diplomatic move, legitimizing the new government. which is in the interest of the West as well. But the remaining Entente powers aren't willing to actually give Russia a big say during this peace conference. So clear your heads of any thought of Russia coming in as a respected fifth power in the Treaty of Versailles. France and Britain would make use of Wilson's suggestions of self-determination in Russia. Poland would still be created and granted independence from both Russia and Germany. As compensation for the loss, it's possible that some parts of Eastern Galicia would be granted to the Russians. Added to this, Finland would at this point have pretty much achieved independence as well, which would now be affirmed in the peace treaties. Belarus and Ukraine would very likely be allowed to remain in this new Russia on the basis that these people are close to Russia as in culture, but the Baltics would be stripped as well. The only front where Russia does potentially make gains would be in Anatolia. Much like in our own timeline, the Allied powers would initially want to completely divide Turkey as well. It is quite likely that in these initial plans for the Ottoman Empire, the Russians would make gains in the Caucasus. But sadly for Russia, with the Turkish War of Independence, these lands would probably not actually be gained. Even if Russia wanted to, there is no way they could raise a competent enough army to force this new border, while there is still so much internal unrest. So, by the end of the Paris peace treaties, the Russians would feel, perhaps rightfully, insulted. The Russian delegates would protest, but in the end the Russians have no leg to stand on. Whatever government is in power, they would have received aid from the West to achieve it. Russia has no competent army to threaten anything with. Russia is still in turmoil, and it will be years before the civil war is fully over. Eventually, the Russians would simply have to accept what the Allies put down, and be happy the Allies didn't decide Ukraine, the Caucasus and Belarus should be independent as well. So, by 1920, the map would look something like this. The new Russian Republic is still troubled and weak, but their borders are now secure. And that would be a big difference to our own timeline. The borders of Russia as they stand are now confirmed and supported by the dominant Western powers. This means that while Poland protests the loss of Eastern Galicia, there will be no war between Russia and Poland. And so we see a much smaller Poland in this alternate timeline. More importantly, Russia is now again a respectable nation. Instead of entering a period of diplomatic isolation on the world stage after World War I, Russia would be accepted. But despite this all, the Russian population would feel betrayed in a similar vein to Italy. They went to war. They fought for 4 horrible years. They didn't surrender. And yet somehow they emerged from the war with a smaller empire than they entered it with. The Russia entering the 1920s would already have been a mostly conservative nation, with the nobles of old returning to a position of prominence, but during the 20s and 30s, Russia would probably continue to backslide into a more conservative, nationalistic worldview. They had stood by the West, by their democracies, and all it gave them was pain and humiliation. Now do note that this does not mean a fascist ideology rises in Russia, but whatever ruling party, monarch or dictatorship, they would still be nationalistic and opposed to the West who betrayed them in some significant fields. Now, economically, Russia goes into a much different direction during the 20s than they did in our own timeline. In our own timeline, the Soviets made many troubled but radical changes to the Russian economy. They forced urbanization, collectivized many industries, controlled production and distribution of goods, and more. These changes had many flaws. The Soviet economy became rigid, with plans being set years in advance. The Soviet economy was slow, as opposition to the regime, combined with little incentive to work harder, make people work just enough. But most importantly, Stalin began a policy of industrialization. By massively exporting agricultural goods, he began to make a radical industrialization scheme primarily focused on heavy industry. The Soviet impact on the Russian economy had mixed success in the short term. In many ways, the Soviets did horrible damage to the Russian economy, but their heavy industry helped greatly during their war with the Germans. So let's compare this now with this alternate Russia. In many ways, it would be a return to a more reasonable pre-war Russia. I have no doubt that this alternate Russia would have more liberalization and freedom for the population, but it would still be a largely autocratic nation. The most important aspect of the new Russian economy would remain agriculture. Meanwhile, industrialization would continue as it had before World War I, slow but steady. Even without the Soviets, the Russian regime would realize that they were hopelessly unready for another big war. There was no war industry, and no chance the Russians could fight a sustained war in the future. So, the new Russian economy over time would be a lot less industrialized, but more healthy. Russia participates in the larger world economy as an exporter of agriculture and raw resources, while the nation slowly but steadily tries to industrialize as well. Now, without the Soviet Union, European diplomacy heavily changes. Russia is now a great power and it would be recognized as it. Russia had fought in the war, they were a troubled democracy, and they would join France and Britain in policing the post-war world order. In order to not completely lose any relations with the West, Russia would seek to repair relations with Poland, Finland and the Baltic states. Russia would not reconquer them during this time, but they are still firmly under Russian influence. A similar story exists in the Balkans, with Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Romania and Bulgaria being loosely aligned with Russia. A joint Franco-Russian alliance would span the continent, protecting it during the 1920s. But this post-war order would continue only until 1929, and then the whole structure would come crumbling down. The Soviet Union was spared from much of the Great Depression thanks to their relative isolation from the world system. This alternate Russia wouldn't be. Russia would, like any other European nation, suffer greatly during the Great Depression. And much like in our own timeline, the table is set for ideological struggle. Now, the non-existence of the Soviet Union would radically change the ideologies emerging in this alternate Europe. Communism gained massive amounts of legitimacy and popularity as an alternative thanks to the existence of the Soviet Union. Without the Soviets as an example, communism across Europe would obviously still exist, but would be less popular. Adding to this, many right-wing movements gained popularity in direct opposition to the threat of the Soviet Union and communism. With no Soviet Union and less popular communism, right-wing movements would be slightly less radical as well. But, despite these relatively minor changes, the bedrock for ideological struggle in Europe was still there. So it is very likely that in some form or another, a rightist ideology still rises in Germany, perhaps still led by an alternate Hitler. This would be a regime with a slightly different set of goals than in our own timeline. Without the Soviet Union, the end goal of taking down communism wouldn't exist. But the goals of tearing down Versailles and creating Lebensraum in the East would still exist. These were not inventions by the Nazis. Now, Russia also has the conditions for a more right-wing ideology to take power, but I highly doubt this would happen. When compared with Italy, Spain or Germany, Russia is a whole different beast. Russia would already be a heavily right-wing nation. Despite having a democracy, much power would still remain in the old nobility and the newly rich capitalists. Despite Russia, like Italy and Germany, being deeply unhappy about the conclusion of World War I have faith that Russia's government doesn't undergo a radical shift. I feel it is most likely that whatever happens in Europe next, Russia will be mainly guided by realpolitik and opportunism, not ideology. And this is where I'll end this scenario. What happens next depends so heavily on what specific people and factions are in power, I cannot even make an educated guess anymore. Without communism in the Soviet Union, the Germans may perceive Russia to be both stronger and more respectable. While eventually Germany would still desire Lebensraum, in this alternate timeline, they may be able to make an alliance with Russia temporarily so that both empires can recreate their own empires. Alternatively, Russia may be more assertive in preserving peace in Europe. If Russia doesn't have a radical ideological shift, they may choose to stick with France and the minor Eastern European nations. Russia could choose to be the protector against German and Italian aggression, guaranteeing the territorial integrity of Europe. With a more assertive Russia taking the lead in European politics, France and Britain would likely choose to follow Russia in standing up to aggression earlier, leading either to Germany starting a hopeless war against Russia, France and Britain again, or more likely, Germany is successfully contained, perhaps gaining Austria, but failing to bully the rest of Europe into more concessions. Or maybe we go the less likely route. Russia, due to the economic crisis, has a second communist revolution and an alternate Soviet Union is established in Russia again. Russia starts a war with the rest of the world and simply wins, establishing a communist world government. Whichever of these you find most likely, I will leave up to you. Let us know in the comments how you think the scenario goes from here. If you liked the video, do please leave a like and a comment against the algorithm. They help us massively. Even just commenting hi helps the channel grow massively. If you want to see more videos, consider subscribing. Thank you all for watching and goodbye.